Hello and welcome back to another episode of Real Talk and ELT. Okay, let's get into it. I'm just making sure that I have things connected the way that they should be. Anyways, okay, here we go. So today I'm going to be looking at the idea of lesson planning, and not necessarily breaking down lesson planning for everybody, but the importance of learning how to build this skill of lesson planning for your classes. So in the beginning of my career, I will say this and I will say this multiple times. I was a terrible teacher. I was a terrible teacher in that not I was terrible. I had the best of intentions, but I had no technical skills. And I think that while teachers need to have lots of soft skills, because it's a education is an industry where we deal with people and we have to understand how to deal with people in the best way possible, etc. I think that we also need to focus on technical skills. And one of the technical skills that I think is really important for teachers to get in their toolkit is lesson planning. Lesson planning, it's a way of breaking things down for students. It's a way of making things manageable, putting them in chunks so that students are able to digest, utilize, and apply whatever you're trying to get across to them. Now, I don't want to harp on the fact, okay, so we know that there's lesson frameworks. This is the terminology that I use. Somebody might use a different one, but I use lesson frameworks. So different lesson frameworks that we have: PPP, TTT, TBL, guided discovery, all of those output, input. There's a bunch of them, right? And they have very specific steps that in order that you follow the steps so that the lesson is structured in a way that it makes sense, it's logical, it increases the difficulty levels and complexity, you can scaffold things in, and you can get through a whole test cycle in one class, whatever the length of time of class is. Now, the reason that this is important, and I think that people need to spend a little bit of time building the technical skill of what is an appropriately planned lesson plan according to, for example, if I'm doing PPP, then how do I build a PPP lesson, and how do I build an effective and productive PPP lesson? Why? Because then I know how to break the rules if I want to break the rules. Because it's all about learning how to manipulate things. It's all about trying to figure out what can you change or modify so that it helps your student. These frameworks have been around longer than me, and they'll be around much longer than I will. And they provide structure and guidance and helpful stages for the student to go through. It feels as if they're doing something during class. It feels as if they're productive and the materials and the delivery of the materials is effective. Now, one of the things that I see as a CELTA tutor is that people struggle with this technical skill, how to build out stages of a lesson that meet what they're trying to do. And I'm not saying, well, CELTA is the initial training courses for teachers. It's, as you go into it, there's also other ones, Cert PT, there's TEFL certificates, all sorts of stuff. But I think that what teachers need, especially in the beginning of their career, and they need refresher courses throughout their career as well, is to say, well, I want the students to do this or produce this or engage this way. The trick is, how can you build an activity that meets that purpose? And I think this is where lesson planning and having some of those more, I'm going to put this in quotes, people, traditional type of lessons helps you, because I don't follow traditional style lessons with my students. Far from it. I don't have planned lessons for every lesson. I use a lot of task-based learning. I use I do dabble. I'm going to say I dabble in Dogme, but I think that Dogme has a very different mass interpretation than what the original Luke Meddings and Scott Thornberry had in mind when they came up with it. I think it's kind of been changed a bit to suit people's personal, I can go off on a rant on that later. Personal proclivities, we can say, is that people like to say, oh, no prep classes. I would caution against that, but sure. I always prepare for my classes. It doesn't mean necessarily that I have beautiful materials all the time and everything's planned and has step-by-step stages, but I do certainly prep my classes. Anyways, the thing about it is that I know that I have a good enough skill set, technical skill set, that when I'm doing things that are less structured and more open to emergent language, more task-based, where students are working on things and trying to get through things, I know that once I identify, this is an area that we need to focus on, or we need to have a little bit more reinforcing activities, something a little bit more structured, so that the student feels comfortable implementing it in their normal speech, then I can always rely on those. So typically what I do is I do lots of, like, again, I work with business English people. I work with executives and things like that they focus primarily on ESP, English for Specific Purposes. And so what I do with that is I have most of the time I do like a task-based lesson. They do a task, and then I analyze, take some notes on the side, and then I decide what sort of more structured lessons can I give them in support of performing that task better. Because I clearly can't do all of that within one lesson. And then sometimes they do the task and they do it great, and the amount of kind of quote unquote follow-up lessons are not necessary, or not that they're not necessary, but there's fewer follow-ups, and then we can kind of move on to the next task that they need to do in their jobs that is going to be helpful for their work functionality. So lesson planning is important, and I think that people need to get comfortable with lesson structures, because you can't reutilize frameworks every class. It gets boring. It gets boring and gets tedious, and students are less engaged. But you need to have a lot of different types of lesson frameworks in your tool belt, so that, for example, if I'm doing a task-based lesson, let me give you a very concrete example. This one happened recently. A student needed to go for a residency interview for a specialization as a physician, a doctor. And they had to do the interview. It was very specific, and it had a specific format. These are the questions and this is that. And it's like, okay, so let's do this. Simulate a mock interview. See where, and use that task-based lesson, that class, as an analysis of what then subsequent classes need to be. So then you can decide, okay, well, this person needs help with this structure. This person needs to amplify their vocabulary regarding discussing or explaining this type of quality that they have, or they need to see some vocabulary regarding specialism, like medical terms or something like that. Oh, and then they probably should be exposed to a person doing this type of interview or talking about this topic in a more confident way, because it doesn't seem as if they're explaining themselves in a confident way. They seem a little timid, and we want to, exude confidence in an interview setting. So then after that task-based lesson, then I've set up a couple lessons, like a PPP lesson, a guide discovery lesson, a little TTT lesson for lexical sets, and then a listening comprehension lesson, but also that looks a little bit at delivery. So it looks a little bit at the discourse of how someone is delivering that message. So from one lesson, I've then planned out 4 or 5 other lessons that are directly connected with what my student needs to do. But I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have the toolkit of, I know how to plan all of these lessons afterwards. I know not only how to identify what the student needs, but then subsequently plan out those lessons. So I know that sometimes people want to do the next new trend and the interesting topics that are coming up and, using technology and that good stuff. But I'm a firm believer of bringing lots of things back to basics, because I think the basics are the basics for a reason. They've been around for a while, and typically they work with the vast majority of people. I'm not saying this is like they all work for everybody, no. But the basics are the basics for a reason. And being able to kind of have that in your back pocket, so that you can look at lesson planning in an objective way, not just saying, well, I think that the student needs to have this, 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 and this, because that's what everybody needs to have. I just don't feel like that's a great attitude. I like to see, like, what does this person need to do? What can they do now? And let's do a little something so I can see how they perform. And then let me plan out some lessons using different styles, using different techniques, different frameworks, so that we can kind of tackle all of the other things that they're still needing support with. So if you limit yourself to only one framework, or if you ostracize another framework or technique because you think that it's not in fashion, or it's antiquated, or it's not in vogue, I hate to break it to you, but a lot of the things that we use now are just spin-offs of original ideas. So if you know what the original ideas are, then you can make the spin-off version of it. Then you can be creative and adapt it. And then if you know what the rules are, you know how to break the rules effectively. I'm all about breaking rules, but you got to break the rules effectively. Because if you're just breaking rules because you want to be different, that's not really going to work for your students, because you always have to think, what is going to have the most effect on our students? What's going to be the most effective in the classroom? And how are we going to have the most progress possible? That's the idea. So my tip and trick for today is go back to the basics, learn about lesson planning, learn about staging, try your hand at aligning what you're proposing in your lesson, and if that's actually going to meet the criteria that you want. Like, I need to do this. And then you say, I'll just do this activity. Well, does that activity really serve that purpose or not? And investigate frameworks and staging and all of that good stuff, so that you can modify and adapt it accordingly based on what your student needs, or based on what you have as an objective in your lessons. So that is my tip and trick for the day. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk in ELT. Want to join the conversation? Head on over to Instagram at Kelly Pettington ELT and send me a message. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube or Spotify channel to stay up to date, and of course, take care of yourself, your health, your vibe, and your tribe. Until next time.